Hello, everyone, and welcome to our COVID-19 and consumer behavior webinar today with Ralf Matthaes, the Managing Director of Infocus Mekong Research. We're going to get started shortly, but before we do, I would like to thank our national sponsors, CM, Manulife, Sun Life, and Vena Capital, as well as our gold sponsors, Baker McKenzie and KPMG, without whom we would not be able to hold events like this. Ralf, please take it away.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Just as a quick heads up, so we do what's called CCI, the Consumer Confidence Index, historically every year in December to understand the year ahead. Now, obviously, the past 2 years have been quite extraordinary. So we've been doing it every quarter, all right? And the whole intent is to understand how the pandemic has impacted consumer confidence. Now, this is the wave 7, quarter 3, and we focused a lot more on the financial impact of the pandemic. So just very quickly before I get going, some of the data I'll show you today includes up to 12,000 consumers, some of it as low as 1,000, all right? It's basically representative of Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, secondary cities, in rural Vietnam, and you can also see close it up, please. Also see the income levels, age, and gender distribution. Okay, so let's get right into it. So obviously, the most important thing that we're talking about today is consumer confidence. Why? Confidence drives spend, or confidence drives tightening the belt. So let's have a quick look. So what you see here is where COVID, in terms of, where consumer confidence was prior to COVID, all right? And you can see confidence was very high, all right? Then all of a sudden we got hit in quarter 2 of last year, and you saw confidence drive down to 27. Then in January, it moved up to 60 because, it looked like COVID had disappeared. And then all of a sudden we got super whacked in quarter 3 this month, in 2021. And we're just coming out of it now in October 21. So this is not a percent. This is out of a 100. This is out of a 110 index, which I can explain later on. All right. But the point is that these are the 3 lowest numbers I've ever seen consumer confidence in Vietnam. And I've been doing this survey since 2001, I believe. So obviously, this has been a major financial shakeup for all of Vietnam. Okay. Now, one of the key notes here is, before COVID, we had 73%. In January, we had 73% of the entire population back at work, all right? Well, now we only have 58% back at work full time because you have a lot on reduced salaries and you have 10% out of jobs. So in most countries, you have a standard 5 to 6% unemployment rate. So what that means is about 15 million people are actually not employed right now in Vietnam, all right? And that's a substantial amount. Now, you will also see that last year, the impact of the pandemic, even though it was not as long, it was not as fierce, and it was not as brutal, the impact was greater. And that was largely because it was the first time we'd experienced the pandemic. We didn't know what to do about the pandemic. And the second time around, I think companies were more aware and better prepared. But what we're seeing is 42% of the population is still going to be negatively impacted by the pandemic in terms of employment, which is ginormous, all right? Now, here's some new data that we have, all right? So what we've done here is we've divided up the employment across Ho Chi Minh City, Hanoi, secondary cities. Now, secondary cities are Da Nang, Can Tho, Hai Phong, Vinh Long, so on and so forth. And what you see here is secondary city employment has been impacted much greater than in the rest of the country. Now, the only thing I can think of is in a lot of the secondary cities, you have the big EPZs, which a lot of them were shut down. And then they also have a lot of services. So for example, like, Da Nang with hospitality and tourism. So these kind of places have actually suffered more than rural Vietnam or the big two cities in the country, all right? Then we ask everybody, very simply, how do you see the economy moving forward? Better, the same, or worse? And what we see from July to October, there's really no difference. People are very pessimistic about the economy, all right, with 64% seeing it as being worse, all right? And remember that number 64, because it comes up again over and over in terms of other figures that I'll show you today, all right? Now, top fears. When we did the survey before the pandemic, the biggest fear was the environment. Things like inflation, the infrastructure system, so on and so forth. Well, all those things have dissipated. Take a look at the blue bar, all right, negative impact on my business, 72%. Now, both the infection and negative impact were never part of our survey before January 2021, all right? Or 2020. So obviously the pandemic has had a ginormous impact on people's fears and, how shall I say, their altruistic outlook on life, all right? Now, where I believe the most important parts are now, what I'm going to talk about here is the real impact, the financial impact, all right? So what you see here, we asked the question, how has the pandemic impacted you financially? And you will see roughly 16% of the population was unaffected, 64% somewhat, 16% struggling, and 5% barely surviving. But then again, take a look at secondary cities. And again, a large part of this is because of the huge number of EPZs in those zones, and also because of hospitality, all right, tourism, okay? So you see, I mean, the greater part of the population has really had been negatively impacted. It's like 84% have had some, or 86 have had some sort of negative impact. Now, what's really interesting is we then broke this down by income levels, okay? And if you take a look, what I find surprising, what's not surprising is obviously the poorest have been impacted the most, so on and so forth, all right? But even the wealthy, there's a percent, 10, 11% who have had a real tough going. Now, I think for people on the call who know Vietnam, the Vietnamese don't like to put money in the bank necessarily for a rainy day. They prefer to invest it. So I think what's happened is their investments have gone down because of the pandemic, and they lack liquidity. So for example, if you look at the rich, the really wealthy, the $100 million income a month, 10% are having a real tough time. And that's probably because they've stretched themselves too thin with their investments. Okay. Now, I think the biggest number I'm going to show you today, of all the people surveyed across Vietnam, and this is a representative sample with about a 3% margin of error, almost 70% their income, their salaries have declined. And also what's interesting is before 60% of the population had multiple incomes, and now it's only 45%. Now, we do a lot of tracking for a company called Shopee, all right? We always measure what's going on in terms of buyers and sellers. Are there more buyers? Are there more sellers? Well, I think what's happening now is a lot of people have lost their main income, and they're using e-commerce as a way to subsidize their income, all right? So I think you're going to see a huge level of increase in terms of sellers of products online, and obviously also buyers, because we were shut out from going to traditional retail outlets, okay? But it just shows you how ravaging this has been. And I think, again, remember I talked about the 64% as being the negative outlook. Well, 69% decline in income. It shows you that it's prevalent across the board, okay? This is just a slightly different way of looking at this, all right? And the one thing that I think is very important to note here is if you take a look, even like again, even the really wealthy, 70% have been negatively impacted by COVID. So it's across the board. You know, it's not just the poor, it's everybody across Vietnam that has had a negative impact by the pandemic, all right? Then within the survey, we also had 300 business owners, all right? And we asked them the question, like, did you say remain open throughout the lockout or were you temporarily closed? And you will see that roughly about 4 in 10 businesses stayed open during the pandemic, okay? But 57% were temporarily closed. But here's the killer. Of those 57%, roughly about 17% have less than 3 months of savings left to maintain their company. So please remember that. The reason I mention this is because I think last year during the pandemic, something like 270,000 businesses went under, okay, in Vietnam. I think that number is going to be much higher this time around because you have to understand last year, we were ill prepared for what broke out, but we were locked down much shorter, but it still had a negative impact. This year, it's a combination of the impact of last year and this year, okay? So when you think about it, the average business that like a retail business or a restaurant or whatever else has been closed for about 8 to 10 months of the last 24 months. Yeah, and that's huge. And so far, 1% that we talked about they've already closed shop, they're done. So I expect that 1% to increase significantly to the end of the year. Because, you know, and it's interesting, I'm sure we've all heard about, you know, you have to be tested and blah, 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 blah. Well, I think if you're in restaurants and hospitality more so, we're obviously a research company. We have a QR code pop, we go in, it's fine. But the point is here, a lot of businesses are weighing the options. Like, do I risk re-employing my staff, paying the rent, when I know that I'm not going to have as many customers as I used to? So I think there's a real psychological battle going on. And I have a feeling that 17%, I'd say at least half of that will probably wind up closing down. So I can easily see of the, call it, well, put it this way, there's over 1 million businesses if you count the non-registered ones in Vietnam, all right? But, so I can easily see another 100, 200,000 closing down the next month, next 2-3 months. So again, this will have a substantial impact on consumer spend. And one other point I'd like to make here, I'm going to use a Canadian analogy here. I'm Canadian. Where we are today is like we've just experienced a huge snowstorm, okay? And now we're digging out. We're digging out our cars, we're digging out the front walkway, we're digging out whatever, and we're only assessing the damage. So I think things are going to be actually worse in the next 2-3 months when businesses finally fall over because we're still closed in many ways. You know, I think, you know, I've heard now that restaurants are about to open up pretty soon. Okay, well, it'd be interesting. Wherever you live in Ho Chi Minh City or Hanoi or wherever you're at today, look around. How many of those businesses that closed 4 months ago will be open in 3 months? And I think that's a good litmus test for yourselves to gauge how well is Vietnam doing. Because remember, Vietnam is a country of SMEs, okay? Now, let's quickly talk about purchase behavior, all right? Now, what we see here is, we do this every year. This is how our index is formed. So we ask individuals how they're going to spend more or less or the same on these 11 categories. And we've been doing this for 20 years, all right? And this time around, what we've noticed is that there's actually, it looks like there's going to be 3 sectors that are going to show some growth. Now, utilities has been growing like wildfire, And it's bad for us because utilities are completely 100% owned by the government. So obviously, when you're locked down for 4 months, you're going to use more electricity, more water, more internet, more email. So those prices go up. So that's actually a negative because it's a higher price for you. But on a positive note, we see a resurgence in food and beverage and healthcare. On a real negative, personal equipment, like I'm sure you saw that the latest iPhone was launched and they showed a bunch of people lining up for that iPhone. Have a look at the line. It was very small. If you take a look at the last iPhone launch, there were people lined up a kilometer. This one was very small. So home appliances, personal equipment, these things, they're in deep trouble. They're in deep, deep, deep trouble. And obviously entertainment, dining out, so on and so forth, it's going to be tough for them, okay? Now, this is something new that I've not done before, but what I've done is I've taken a look at all 3 quarters in terms of what people said in terms of growth versus decline, all right? And look, this is just anecdotal, all right? But the point is, we look to be down almost 30% on consumer spend at the end of Q3, okay? And what's interesting about this number is I've spoken to a couple of my bigger FMCG clients, and ironically, they're saying they're down between 25 and 40%. So that 29% down, I think, is actually fairly accurate. Now, obviously, every business is different, okay? But I mean, that's heavily driven by, the restaurant, dining, blah, 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 being really impacted in a bad manner here, all right? What's also interesting, and this is, I think, one of the greatest trends, which are actual structural shifts. Before COVID, 80% of the market in terms of spend was at traditional stores, traditional trade. Traditional trade, we mean wet markets, your mom and pop stores. Modern trade, we mean like the supermarkets, the hypermarkets, e-commerce. And you can see in a short 8 months, the spend is almost identical. So modern trade has actually grown substantially during COVID, but at the expense of traditional trade, all right? So this is, I think, one of the major, not trends, but structural changes in Vietnam, where, let's be fair, I'm from Canada, or wherever you're from, and, it's a modern trade world, all right? And Vietnam has been very slow to move into the modern trade environment, and it's happened. So it's here to stay. Modern trade will continue to grow, and I have no doubt that in 2 years or so, it will dominate traditional trade. The other thing is with a lot of these traditional trades, they're going to go out of business, yeah, which is kind of a shame because that's one of the flavors and characteristics that makes Vietnam so unique, okay? And sorry, this is a bit of a confusing chart. So if you just look at the little box below, so what we see is about 30% of all spend is on groceries, which are necessities, other necessities like transportation, utilities, 10% on savings, 9% on education, and 7% on paying off debt. Now, obviously, we've always had some level of debt, but that's now one of the major spend items is paying off debt. So what we see here is discretionary spend. So outside of sort of your top necessities is only 29%. Unfortunately, I don't have the numbers of what it was pre-pandemic, but what we're going to do from here on in is measure how these change. Because again, that's a great way of understanding how an economy is doing, okay? So I'm just going to sum up with a final slide here, and then we'll get to the Q&A. So as a summary, look, employment has slightly increased, but that's just because people have gone from part-time to full-time again, and you still have 10% unemployment. So the end of the year, the spend will be lower. all right? And I estimate it'll at least be 10% lower than it was at the start of the year. So my estimate is that spend for the year total will be minus 20 to 25% for the whole year, all right? So I'm sure you've seen all the different pundits talking about the GDP growth. A big portion, roughly about 65% of our economy is based on the domestic economy. So if you consider that the spend will be down probably by 20, 25%, that's going to be significant. So I would be absolutely surprised if GDP growth was anywhere above 1.5% for the year. So, you know, considering, I think at the start of this year, we said 6.7, 6.8%. So, you know, it's going to be tough times moving forward. In terms of consumer confidence, it has slightly increased. But here's the key. Yes, consumers are happier, things are a lot, but they have a lot less money. There's much more unemployment, and a lot of people have their savings have been destroyed. Okay. Now, Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi are fairly resilient places, and the people are fairly resilient. However, your secondary cities, because they rely on the EPZs and the tourism and whatnot, they're going to have a longer time to recuperate. Okay. I was speaking to a friend of mine in Da Nang, and she told me yesterday that restaurants have been open for a week now. And she says, but they're still pretty empty. Okay. In terms of spending capability, because this is what drives everything. All right. Remember, 69, 68% are making less money. And 50% of the low income are in really serious deep trouble. All right. Now, I think there's going to be two interesting impacts here. Okay. And I think the one is the HR market. I think you're going to see like entry-level salaries become lower. I think you're going to see much lower salary increments, salary increases. It's definitely going to become an employer's market. The only negative I see is a lot of people have gone back to the countryside. A lot of, you know, especially migrant workers and whatever else. It's going to be hard to find workers, actually. So I think you're going to wind up lower offers, but also a lower talent pool, because a lot of people are going back to their hometowns and whatnot. So it's going to be disrupt. It's going to disrupt employment. Then, in terms of fears, look, the number one fear is absolutely business survival. All right, and the poor are becoming poor, and I think this may start to create some unrest. I will just leave it at that. I think we all understand what that means. All right. And I think we're going to see a massive spike in bankruptcies over the next 3 months, between 10 and 20%. What here is a structural shift as well. A lot of companies have been very dominant in Vietnam for the last 10 years. And I think some of that dominance has slipped away. As I said, I know a couple of very large FMCG companies who have, for the first time in 20 years, not grown by 10, 20%, but actually declined. All right. And these big companies historically have not been set up for that. So you're going to see them shift to cheaper vendors, cheaper suppliers, reduce their overall budgets, which is going to have, again, a great impact. And, you know, the government really needs to reach out to the poor to help them, because they're in dire straits. In terms of categories, as I said before, F&B and healthcare, and to a lesser extent, education and personal care will see positive growth. You can imagine, you know, if you're a woman, an executive working at a company, you haven't gone to the office for 4 months. Do you really need to buy skin whitening? Do you need to buy new mascara? Do you need to buy new eyeliner? No. Now, as people get back to work, they're going to start to resupply. So I think those personal goods are going to start to grow. All right. And also, you know, hospitality, entertainment, and home appliances are in deep, deep trouble. And I think there's going to be a shift, a structural shift. Now, I'm not, my crystal ball is at the dry cleaners. But, you know, if you look at, like, say, the electronic stores, I think you're going to see less and less electronic stores, and maybe see a superstore, and then everything else will be done by buying online. So I think those are some of the structural changes that you're going to see in retail. All right. And then finally, as behavior change, consumers are going to be much more cautious, and they're going to really focus on what is necessary, okay, as opposed to what I want. Because I can imagine that a lot of people's savings have been drained by this, all right? The negative of that is I think we're going to see a lot of wealthy people start to do heavy land grabs, business and other assets. So there's going to be a distressed assets grab coming up very shortly, which is not a positive thing. So before I open up for questioning and give it back to Ryan, the bottom line for me is we've got a rocky road to recovery for at least about 60 to 70% of the population. All right. So to the end of the year, it's dismal. And I think we're not going to really change until we have bars, restaurants, and hospitality open. And I have heard that hospitality may not open till June of next year. Okay. So I'll hand it back to to Ryan, and happy to field any questions you may have.
Thanks, Ralph. We covered all sorts of information, and I'm sure that there's some people with some questions out there.